This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
You are listening to The Morning Run. I'm Shazana Mokhtar with Khoo, Chuang and Philip C. We are turning our attention to Sarawak because speculation is rife that the Sarawak State Assembly may be dissolved soon to make way for an election, which will take place by year end. So just to recap, the State Assembly expired on June 6th this year and is currently suspended as Sarawak is under a state of emergency that will end on February 2nd next year.
That's not very soon, Shah. But as buzz for a state election intensifies, Chief Minister Datuk Patinggi Abang Johari Openg has called for patience. Shortly after admitting he was granted an audience with the Yang di-Pertuan Agong recently, although it was only to discuss the emergency ordinances and COVID matters.
Observers have voiced concerns about having another election during the pandemic, but another reason they have for delaying the polls till next year is to wait until after Undi 18 is implemented, which will see those 18 years above and above as eligible voters, and this will take place by the end of the year. But the question is, will the state-ruling GPS party be prepared to deal with a wave of new and unknown voters who might yet change the political landscape the party is familiar with?
So for more on this, we're speaking to political commentator Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. Thanks for joining us, James. Always good to have you. Now, if the Sarawak State Assembly is dissolved soon, when do you think elections will be called? And is it a wise decision considering that 90% of Sarawakian adults are now fully vaccinated?
Good morning. So I think the expectations is that if the Dune will be dissolved, the elections will be held at the end of November or early December at the latest. Now, in terms of the public opinion, I think generally speaking, the majority of the public are not very comfortable with this. Although a lot of Sarawakians have been vaccinated, I think the thinking is that this may become some sort of a super spreader event. But people also realize that the Malacca elections will probably be held first, so people will be looking at these two state elections carefully if it goes ahead.
And with people speculating about elections being called sooner rather than later, some observers are saying that it's because GPS is aiming to beat the Undi 18 deadline set for the end of the year. What's your thoughts on this?
Yes, there's lots of talk that the reasons why they need to hold it very quickly is because they're afraid of young people who might be coming out to vote. But my position is very different. My position is that there's no guarantee that these young people will vote against the government. Secondly, in Malaysia, we don't have compulsory voting. So our voting turnout is about 60%. And I suspect for the young people, the under 21s, it won't be too much of a difference. And thirdly, most of the young people are registered in the urban areas. So it really doesn't matter because most of the urban areas are already opposition hands. Those who are registered in the rural areas will find it very difficult to go back during the voting day. So in my view, there's really nothing to be afraid of. I think the main reasons why they probably want to do it is because they've got a big wing on their hands. As many of your listeners know, next week, the MA63 amendments will go before Parliament, and GPS can go and tell the people of Sarawak that we are the only people who have actually done something about MA63. Because as you all know, Pakatan Harapan tried to do it in 2019. They were not able to do it. So GPS can claim to be the real champions of MA63 by moving the amendments along next week.
So what do young people in Sarawak want to see actually? Why are they afraid of young people?
I think the fear is not only in Sarawak, but generally speaking, I think there's a misconception in Malaysian politics that young people tend to be anti-establishment, that if you give them the vote, they will vote against the government, whoever the government is. But I think this is a myth. I think there are actually a lot of young people who are actually pro-government, or their ideology is probably on the right side, right-wing side. So there's no guarantee that young people will vote against the government. But my point is that even if the young people, the majority vote against the government, most of these young people are registered in urban areas anyway. And we know that most of the urban areas are in the hands of the opposition. So it really sort of evens out in the end. So there's really nothing to fear for the young voters.
So James, just so I'm clear, are you expecting Sarawak state elections to be held before the end of this year? Or could there be something that sort of thwarts that timetable?
I think the reality is that it's really up to the Agong, the king. whether he will grant a special exemption for Sarawak whole state elections. And of course, on the Sarawak government side, I think they're ready to go. In fact, they've been ready for the last year and a half. Most of the machineries are out. I think the only thing that hasn't been done is the printing of the posters, because the candidates are always announced at the very last minute. Other than that, I think the machinery is in place. I think there's a strong push in GPS, especially led by people like Karim, the tourism minister, to hold election as soon as possible. Part of it has got to do with the 18, but a bigger part of it is the fact that the opposition in Sarawak is hopelessly divided. Pakatan Harapan in Sarawak hasn't held a meeting in months. They're not even capable of issuing a joint statement. PKR in Sarawak has no leader. They have a council of leaders. Basically, the opposition is in a mess. The real opposition to GPS is actually a local-based party called PSB. They're not willing to talk to Pakatan at this moment, but of course they may turn around once the election date is announced. But basically, on the opposition side, they have many problems. And if the election is held this year, I expect GPS to steamroll over the opposition in Sarawak.
And what will you be looking out for in terms of political parties and their movements if elections are called?
So basically, I think in terms of parties with real machinery that can sort of put out a challenge to GPS, a reasonable challenge, will be PSB and DAP. I don't think PKR is in a position. The other party that is making a lot of noise, especially in social media, is a party called PBK. And PBK party, Bumi Kingalang, is notorious because they are the only political party in the whole of Malaysia openly advocating for the succession of Sarawak from the Federation. So they're making a lot of noise, but I expect 90% of the candidates to lose their deposit. One of the things about Sabah and Sarawak politics is that the noise do not correlate to the actual voting. So you will find that a lot of these candidates, they may be very high profile in social media. You may see them walking around the shops, shaking hands and what have you. But in election day, the voting outcome is not connected at all.
Well, so that means it doesn't translate. Can I just bring to the point on MA63, because that is likely to pass through Parliament, because you recognize Sabah and Sarawak as equal partners. What does this actually tangibly mean on the ground? What does it change in terms of the dynamics between federal government and the two states?
No, it doesn't change anything. It's largely symbolic. Basically, what the amendment will do was that in the Part 1 of the Constitution, it will put Sabah and Sarawak in a separate line. So basically, you can argue symbolically, each of these are three wilayas, three separate territories to form the Federation of Malaysia. The second part is mostly to make sure that the Constitution, in terms of origination, that it refers to the Malaysia Act as the origin for the Federation of Malaysia. The other amendment is, of course, they want the definition of natives of Sarawak to be passed on to the Sarawak Constitution. So the federal constitution will follow the Sarawak Constitution in terms of the definition of a native. And of course, this is crucially important because as a native of Sarawak, this means that you have Bumiputra status. And of course, as you know, Malaysia is divided into Bumiputra and non-Bumiputra, and being a Bumiputra comes with a whole host of state benefits.
And do you expect these amendments to pass, James? Just what do you think, since we haven't actually seen the voting on this yet?
Sure. We don't know what is the actual wording. We know that the cabinet has met on this issue. Cabinet will have the final say about the final wording. Of course, on paper, there's really no reasons for any MPs from Sabah and Sarawak to say no to these amendments. This is something that is wildly popular in Sabah and Sarawak, but we do not know what the stance of the major party is. You have to remember, a lot of these parties, say UMNO, PAS or whatever, they do not actually have to oppose the amendments. They can actually just abstain. So if you're abstaining and you don't get a two-thirds majority, the amendment will not pass as well. So I think everything is up in the air. Right now, the key parties on the Peninsula side have kept very quiet about this MA63 amendment issue. I think part of it is because they were not really consulted on the final wording. I think there will be a bit of last-minute horse trading in terms of trying to decide whether they want to support this or not. You also have to remember that on the Peninsula side, this is really a non-issue. So they do not want to be seen, to be supporting this amendment and making it a big issue. because I think the Malay right-wing groups and a lot of the people in the Malaysian establishment do not like this idea of giving more powers to Sabah and Sarawak and sort of supporting indirectly this idea that Sabah and Sarawak are distinct from the Malaysian Federation.
James, thanks very much for speaking to us this morning. That was Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania, talking to us about the Sarawak state elections and what we can expect out of it. It could take place before the end of the year. Essentially, it's still a waiting game. It's possible, but not really confirmed. Everything's still up in the air.
I was quite intrigued by his stance on the youth voter because I didn't expect him to say necessarily that they were pro-establishment. But it's a very subjective, a very personal point of view. We don't know because you can't dipstick, millions of people, can you?
Stay tuned. BFM 89.9.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.